So we're going to look at the genealogies within Matthew and Luke of Jesus. And one of the things that genealogies tell us is genealogies tell us about our ancestry and something about where we are going based on our ancestors. But genealogies also tell us something about where we came from. And by understanding where we come from and where Jesus came from, hopefully we can understand something about Jesus and what the Gospels want us to know about Jesus. The genealogies of Matthew and Luke are different. Some of the names are the same, but most of the names are not. So you have to understand that, first of all, they are not meant to be historical. They're meant to be theological. They're telling us something about who Jesus is. So in order to understand the genealogies, while there are similarities, what we have to focus on is the differences. Because the differences are going to help us to understand what the Christology and what the theology is behind the individual Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So, first of all, let's look at the way they move. Matthew moves forward in time, from the earliest time period to the birth of Jesus. Luke, on the other hand, works backwards in time. So you have to ask the question, why? Matthew works from the earliest time to Jesus' birth. Luke works from Jesus' birth back to the earliest time. So the question is, why the difference? So for Matthew works forward in time. The answer for Matthew is actually fairly simple. For Matthew, Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise that is made to the Jewish people. So he begins with Abraham, and he moves forward through time to Jesus. And he begins with Abraham because Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. It is with Abraham that God first makes the covenant with the Jewish people. So for Matthew, he moves forward in time because Jesus is the fulfillment of history. He is the fulfillment of the covenant that was made with Abraham. So Matthew moves forward in time and says this is the covenant through David, through the Exodus, through the Babylonian exile. God is fulfilling the covenant made with Abraham. Luke is different. Luke works backwards in time. For Luke, he's not concerned with what Matthew was concerned with, where Jesus is the fulfillment of history. For Luke, he wants you to know where Jesus actually comes from. So for Luke, he wants the people to understand that Jesus is ultimately the Son of God. So within his genealogy, he keeps saying son of, son of, son of. And he traces Jesus back, all the way back to Adam. And he ends his genealogy not with Adam, but by saying Adam, the Son of God. So for Luke, the ultimate theology is Jesus is the Son of God. Another difference between Matthew and Luke is the mention of Jesus' parents. Luke only mentions Joseph. He says Joseph is the father of Jesus. To quote from Luke, Jesus was the son, as was thought, of Joseph. And then he goes, son of, son of, son of. So for Luke, he's emphasizing the idea of son of. Again, ultimately back to Jesus as the Son of God. Now Matthew Matthew mentions Joseph and Mary, and he makes the point to say that Jesus is the son of Mary, not Joseph. Now, this breaks the rhythm within Matthew, because Matthew all the way through said father of, father of, father of, father of. And so at the end, he finally says Jesus is the son of Mary, not Joseph. He wants to emphasize the fact of the miraculous nature of Jesus' birth. So that's why he doesn't say Jesus is the son of Joseph. Matthew wants to focus on the miraculous aspect. So he focuses on Mary and not Joseph. So the third question is, why did Matthew include women in his genealogy? Matthew includes 5 women. Now, including women within the genealogy was generally not done because descendancy was determined through the father, not the mother. So Matthew includes these 5 women. So the question becomes, why? Well, let's look at the 5 women. First off, you have Tamar. We didn't really talk about Tamar, but Tamar appears in the book of Genesis. Secondly, we have Rahab, who you all should remember was the woman from the town of Jericho. Then there's Ruth, who with her mother-in-law Naomi, Ruth eventually marries Boaz and becomes the great-grandmother of David. Then we have, in Matthew's genealogy, a woman identified as the wife of Uriah, who we all know is Bathsheba, who is David's wife, and David has Uriah killed, and Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon. And finally, we have Mary. So the question is, why does Matthew include these 5 women? The answer is that you have to look to see what do they have in common. And what they have in common is that God worked through each of them to ensure the covenantal promise would continue and that the covenantal promise would be met and kept. They each worked in their own way, sometimes through duplicity, but they each worked in their own way to keep and ensure the covenantal promise that was made with Abraham, that the covenant made with Abraham would continue and would be fulfilled. So for Matthew, Jesus' birth by Mary, even though considered out of the ordinary, fulfills the covenant. And Mary is true to the covenant made by Abraham, just as these other 4 women were as well. So Matthew includes these women in his genealogy to make this point. So why the number 14 in Matthew? Matthew makes a point of letting people know that there are 3 distinct historic periods, each historic period having 14 generations. So why 14? Obviously, the number has to have some kind of symbolic meaning. So, one of the first things that comes up a lot when people are talking about it is, what about 7 plus 7? That equals 14. 7 and 7, 2 of what are considered the perfect numbers. So 14 being twice as perfect. It's a possibility, except for one thing. Within the Hebrew language, if you're going to do a superlative, so in English we have good, better, best. Best is the superlative of good. If you're going to do a superlative in Hebrew, you use a triplet. You don't double. So if it was going to be superlative, the most perfect, you'd use it 3 times. So you'd use the number 21. So that's probably not the answer. So then why 14. Still have this question. The answer is actually not that hard. Matthew wasn't trying to keep something a secret. Within the ancient world, and some people still use it today when they're trying to write like coded messages, every letter of the alphabet had a numerical value. Okay? So within Hebrew, the Hebrew letters, and I'm just going to give you about the first 10. You have Aleph, you have Bet, you have Gimel, Daleth, He, Wa, Zion, Chet, Tet, Yod, and Kaf. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. First 11 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now each letter has a numerical value. So you only have to ask the question, what letters add up to 14? Going to jump ahead now. Make it easy. The letters that add up to 14 is you take the numerical value 4 plus 6 plus 4. That equals 14. So if we look at the Hebrew letters that correspond to each of these values, you have Daleth, you have Daleth here, and in the middle you have Waw. Okay? For the English, it's D, W, D, which in Hebrew is pronounced Dawid, which is the name, say it with me, David. So what Matthew wants the people to understand is that Jesus is a descendant of David, and as a descendant of David is therefore the Messiah. So he uses the symbolic number of 14 for each of the generations. So I hope that helps in understanding the genealogies, maybe makes them a little clearer. Tomorrow we'll actually be looking at the birth narratives themselves in Matthew and Luke, and then you will have a clearer understanding of what the theology is of both Matthew and Luke. Have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow.